Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ewan Darby and I run the affiliate marketing team for Neo at Ogilvy in London. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here and introducing our keynote speaker for today, Mr. Rory Sutherland. As Deputy Chairman of the Ogilvy Group UK, Rory does occasionally visit the London office between his global speaking engagements and provides inspiration to the mere mortals of the agency with his unbounded enthusiasm for the advertising industry and for his insight into behavioural economics and consumer behaviour. By merging his passion for behavioural economics with his fabulous speaking style and sartorial elegance, Rory has become a highly sought-after individual by advertising and media organisations, government, educational establishments the world over. A few months ago, Rory came to speak to the management team at Neo at Ogilvy, which is Ogilvy's media division. And what became increasingly obvious during his 2 hours relentless speaking were the very obvious links between affiliate marketing and behavioural economics. And I vowed then to find an appropriate platform to get Rory to come and speak to the industry. Thankfully, Matthew Wood agreed that this was such an appropriate environment, and so I'd be grateful if you would join me in welcoming Mr. Rory Sutherland.
Thank you very much indeed. What I'm talking about mostly today is psychology, consumer psychology, and why people buy. And I make no apology for that, for the simple reason that I think over the last 15 years, what we've seen is a spectacular explosion in the number of media, the number of channels, and indeed the number of modes and moments in which businesses can communicate with people. And actually, I'll go even further. I'll say I don't expect to see the next 15 years to be anything like as dramatic. I know people tend to believe that all technological progress is exponential. But in very many ways, you know, actually, I don't think in the rest of our lifetimes, I think the revolutions and the technical revolutions we see will be of two slightly different kinds. One of which is more or less continuous gradual improvement of what already exists. And the second thing will be extraordinary progress in fields that we didn't even envisage today or 5 years ago. The reason I make this point is that actually progress tends to be, and that's as true of, say, human evolution or something as it seems to be of anything else, it seems to happen in bursts. And broadly speaking, if you look at the motor car by 1937, broadly speaking, it's recognizably what we think of as a car today. Obviously, we've made things inordinately better through gradual improvement, but the essential conceptual question was solved in the 30s. Maybe there'll be a new kind of car in another 10 or 15 years which somehow works in some different way, a different kind of engine, patently. But by and large, you know, I don't expect change over the next 15 years to be as rapid as over the last 15. Now, why that's important, I think, is because it gives us a little bit of a breathing space to say, what do we need to do to catch up? You know, don't necessarily assume that the sort of revolutionary weirdness you've seen over the next 15 years is going to continue. So where I think we need to catch up is that the pace of change over the last 15 years has outstripped the models and processes and systems we have for understanding it. There are various examples I'll give. In Britain, we've recently had a scandal where legal injunctions to prevent the publication of footballers who've had extramarital affairs have been blown wide open by the use of Twitter, for example. This is a case where, you know, the pace of technological change massively outstripped the speed of legislative change. So the law moved a lot slower than technology did. I think it's also true, if you look at the use of things like email, that our basic sort of etiquette actually was outpaced by the way people started using these media. I still don't think people make optimal use of different communication channels or very intelligent use of them. And actually, you know, had this change not been so rapid, we might have given a bit more thought to, you know, what should be an email, what should be a text, what should be a phone call. There's a danger that people start to use those interchangeably. I think we all suffer for that reason. But the third thing is that if you look at our models of human understanding, particularly those used by marketers, they patently, rather like the law still hasn't caught up with the use of Twitter, I think it's fair to say that the models and metrics used in marketing are hopelessly out of date and have failed to keep pace with the advances made in media. And so I think the most important thing to do in the next 15 years is not to seek ever greater technological progress. I think the progress will be made in understanding people and actually advancing human understanding in a way that keeps step with our technological progress. And I don't think that's happened before. Now, I've called this sales and salability. I'll explain why, I'll explain why now. One of the most important things which I think marketing, it's a mistake that marketing has made, is that if you look at theoretical physics, broadly speaking, theoretical physicists are among the most intelligent people in the world. Reasonable thing to say. And for a very, very long time, they tried to reduce the fundamental forces in the universe down to one. A few people claim they've got it down to 3, but most people accept in theoretical physics that there are 4 forces at work. Gravity, electromagnetism, I think there's the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force. Is that right, or is it the strong atomic force? Any nuclear physicists here? But anyway, there are 4 of them, okay? Relax, don't worry. And they accept that there are 4 different forces. I think what's happened, because the metrics and models of advertising effectively all were created in the Don Draper age, in the age of Mad Men and the age of one super-dominant mass medium, there still survives in marketing the idea that there's only one force at work. By and large, conventional marketing says that force is brand preference, and brand preference translates into purchase behavior. And that's it. Now, what you all know, because you've been practicing affiliate marketing, is that it doesn't work like that. Whatever you know from the conventional model, it's clear to you that there are forces at work in human behavior which aren't explained either by conventional brand models or by logic, to be absolutely honest. You know, and that's another perfectly reasonable model you can bring to bear in terms of understanding human behavior as just simple, free market logic. And by the way, quite a lot of the time it works. Very often, if you reduce the price of something, more people buy it. But that's not universally true. Patently, what we need to understand is there is stuff going on and there are forces at work which we don't fully understand, which we don't know how to measure, and which our current research techniques don't detect. So it's a bit like trying to understand all the motion in the universe when you've got a gravity meter, but you can't detect electromagnetism. Every now and then you're going to get confused. Now, the first really helpful step, I think, to understanding that there's more than one force at work came from an advertising man, a great advertising man in the UK called Paul Feldwick, who made the point about brand advertising, saying that actually what conventional brand advertising does isn't necessarily sales, it's salability. That by lending fame, social proof, visible commitment by an advertiser to a brand, you may not actually be selling, but you're rendering the thing something that people are prepared to buy. And that's a different thing to selling. If you look at, I've worked on American Express for 20 years, and the brand advertising work does not sell directly. What it does is it means that when a banner, or a piece of direct mail, or an email, or an appearance in a money-saving site mentions the American Express card, people who would, under normal circumstances, not be willing to purchase this product, see the name American Express, and it falls within their repertoire of acceptable things to buy. What this is a heuristic. Has anybody heard the word heuristic? A few of you. Conventional marketing thinking has 2 beliefs. It believes that brand preference translates into purchase behavior. Now, one of the questions I ask is, does actual preference exist in most people's heads most of the time? And an email went around Ogilvy recently. It said, what is your favourite coffee shop? Rank these 3 coffee shops in order. One's, Starbucks, Costa Coffee, Cafe Nero, and there was a 4th chain. Okay? Now, I'm a classicist, and I find Cafe Nero very disappointing. Because the whole Nero theme, it doesn't pick up on that at all. You know, there's no one being tortured, there's no brutality going on. You know, Cafe Nero, but no. But I actually fired back an email saying, I'm not sure this is the right question to ask. Which is, do we actually, most of us, now marketers might, because marketers love to draw really fine distinctions between brands, and they love to rank things because they're brand obsessed. But to function as a human being, you don't need an order of preference for coffee shop chains. Research will always force one out of you because they ask that question and you'll answer it. And the way you'll probably answer it, by the way, is based on your past behaviour. The coffee shop you go to most often, you will say is your favourite. But I don't think that actually that idea of ranked preference really, in order to function as a human being, I don't need to carry around in my head a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ordering of coffee shops. All I need is coffee shops that are probably going to be okay and coffee shops that I probably won't risk. Okay? So that's the difference between sales and saleability. What brand advertising does is it imbues a quality of fame, recognition, and reputation on a product that means that people, first of all, are readier to buy it, and secondly, will pay more for it. But you can do all that without selling. If American Express simply did the brand work and never did the direct mail, never did the behavioural stuff, there'd be about 500 card members worldwide. But equally, if you try and do the selling stuff without the brand work, if you try and do sales without basic saleability, you'll also fail. Because people, there's a very, very strong instinct, which is don't buy things you've never heard of. That's a heuristic. It's one of many, many mental shortcuts that people take. And one of them is simply, broadly speaking, you can trust things that are famous. And by the way, this is not illogical. Now, how many of you here are Germans? Any Germans? Excellent. Good to see you. One of the greatest experts, actually, on the whole business of heuristics is actually a chap at the Max Planck Institute called Gerd Gigerenzer. Has anybody heard of him? This is a huge book on heuristics, edited by Gerd Gigerenzer, along with Thorsten Patscher and another guy I've never heard of. And this is, you know, a work on how humans use mental shortcuts to make decisions. Now, it's about 60 or 70 euros to buy this book. However, since it contains a chapter specifically on the heuristics that dogs use to catch frisbees, I think it's cheap at twice the price, personally. But the point about this whole subject of heuristics is that most of the time we do not make perfect, optimal decisions. In many cases, it's a waste of time trying to make an optimal decision because we simply could never acquire the information that's necessary to make an optimal decision. We know too little about the future to do that. So if you look at a man catching a ball, in theory, cricket or baseball players, when they need to catch a ball, could use advanced Newtonian physics to work out where the ball's going to be and catch it. The problem is, by the time you've done the mathematics, the ball's landed about 10 minutes ago. So what humans use instead is a simple rule of thumb, which is, I think, you extrapolate from the path of the ball, and they're basically very simple mathematical rules that dogs use to catch frisbees and humans use to catch balls. These heuristics, or little shortcuts, are also used when we buy things. Probably one of the most powerful heuristics is if you're faced with 3 choices, an expensive one, a medium-priced one, and a cheap one, you buy the one in the middle. Very, very strong biases. One of the strongest heuristics is pay extra for a well-known brand, it's worth it. By the way, this is not, it's very tempting to see this as an example of irrationality. One of the things that Gerd Gigerenzer is absolutely clear about is that looked at from a Darwinian perspective, this is anything but irrational. It makes incredibly good sense. Because heuristics are very, very quick, they're instinctive. Now, this is important because they don't show up in market research, because they actually operate at an instinctive level, not a conscious level. Okay? So market research, just as a gravity meter is blind to electromagnetism, market research is blind to the operation of heuristics. But they're incredibly powerful. So, let me just talk a little bit more. There are multiple forces at work. Some of these forces are at work below the level of human consciousness, which means that market research does not detect them. Really, really important. Logic doesn't detect them, because when we use logic, we actually tend to look at things in a much more logical way and a much less instinctive way. And I'll show you a few examples where purchase behavior defies logic coming up now. But we've got these thousands of new channels. What we need now is new models of understanding human behavior that make sense of what people do and that have some real predictive value. Or actually, to be honest, you don't need predictive value. What you need is just, they give you great insights which encourage you to test really intelligent things. So in your business, because of your wonderful freedom to measure, the best thing you can be doing is actually, in many cases, is just coming up with really imaginative, intelligent tests. Tests on pricing, tests on placing. I'll show you a few examples coming up. So bear in mind that this business of advertising conveying confidence and saleability, that happens in nature. The peacock's tail is a deliberate display of spare resources by a male peacock, which is attractive to peahens. It says, I'm so genetically fit as a bird that I can still function while carrying around this ludicrous thing on my back purely for decorative purposes. Okay? It's rather like rich people have to buy pointless things to show you're rich. You know, if you think about it, if women were attracted to men with expensive vehicles, they'd all chase lorry drivers. But a lorry has no status value because it's actually useful. What you need is a two-seater Ferrari with no luggage capacity at all, and that proves you're rich. If you spend money on something pointless, it's a much better proof, and that's how the peacock's tail works. It works because it's purely decorative and useless. There are other devices which work the same way advertising does. A wedding ring or a wedding works this way. Why? Because actually, what you need in a man, if you're marrying someone, is someone who isn't going to disappear after 6 months. And an engagement ring acts as an upfront commitment device. That if you're prepared to spend a few $1,000s on this thing, you're probably going to stick around for a while. Because it'd be very, very expensive as a way of procuring a one-night stand, if you think about it. That's why, by the way, a wedding is just a torture test for men. Everything about a wedding is things that women like and men hate. It's basically testing the Y chromosome to destruction, okay? Everything you hate as a bloke, okay, if you think about it, it's color coordination, dyeing the bridesmaids' shoes, menu planning, table arrangements, flowers, fabrics, colors, everything that blokes can't stand, okay? And that's there because if a bloke can actually go through all that grief. Have you noticed, by the way, on a wedding list, you cannot put down any masculine item. If you put down like an Xbox 360, it's replaced with a colander within about 10 minutes, okay? Now, if you think about it, that's designed because men arguably potentially have shorter-term interests in breeding than women do, because it's not necessary for them to stick around to look after the children. This is called in economics asymmetry. There is an asymmetry there. And when you have asymmetries, you need signaling. So if you think about it, if it was the other way around, if weddings were designed for men, basically, which would be 6 days of drunken quad biking, followed by a day when all your friends bought you high-end consumer electronics and large plasma screen TVs. What would happen is men would be desperate to get married and complaining that their girlfriends were afraid of commitment, okay? But these things, now advertising, why you are not irrational in responding to in paying extra for advertised goods is it's exactly the same thing. There are two ways of doing business. You can either make a quick buck selling something that isn't very good to somebody once, or you can invest in a long-term reputation, and in terms of game theory, you can play a long-term repeat game where you aim to engage in continual value exchange within a relationship of trust. The fact that you put money up front, as the peacock does or the advertising budget does, suggests that you're playing the long game, because it wouldn't pay you to do this. It wouldn't pay you to spend all that money on advertising if you were just planning to make a one-off sale. Similarly, if you think about it, if you have a valuable brand on which you spend a lot of money, it hurts you much more to sell a bad product than someone with no reputation at all. Because actually, someone with no reputation at all, if they make a quick buck selling you something that's rubbish, they lose nothing. Someone with a long-term reputation built up over years and millions of pounds in advertising loses more than they gain if they sell you a product that's rubbish. So choosing to buy things from people who spend money on advertising is actually, although we do it subconsciously, Robin White, the advertising man in Britain, calls it the reputation reflex. We actually do it reflexively. Try this. Go and buy a plasma screen TV this weekend, and you'll look at plasma screen TVs from obscure manufacturers you haven't really heard of, and you'll nearly buy it, but you'll get a bit frightened. And what you'll do at the last minute is you'll go, there's one over there by LG or Sony or Samsung. It's 150, 200 euros more, but I just feel better about it. I mean, try the experiment. You will actually experience visceral fear in buying a brand of television that you've never heard of, even though it might save you £200. But actually, looked at in the past of your life, this decision has served you pretty well. By and large, the things you've bought from famous brands have been pretty good, and the things you've bought from obscure brands have not always, but often, been disappointing. If you look back on the course of your life, everything you've bought from tents to, to IT, to, your broadband supplier, to whatever. Now, I'll come to another point now. This is exactly the peacock's tail, by the way, if you go back just to that picture, in the corporate world. That was what Chrysler said in 1928 to say, we are a really healthy, fit company. Architecture is a form of display. It's a form of advertising. But what we're seeing now from neuroscience, we're seeing from behavioral economics, we're seeing from experiments, is quite a lot of the world works backwards. Now, what I didn't say, you'll notice, is that when you buy something that's branded and famous, it'll be the best thing you can possibly buy with the money. Okay? What I can say is that things that are produced by famous brands are very unlikely to be bad. Now, one of the strongest biases in human psychology is that a thing called loss aversion, and we fear loss twice as acutely as we hope for gain. Now, conventional market research makes it look as though when people go shopping, they're looking for the very best thing they can buy. So if you ask people the question, how did you choose that television? Well, you said, well, I looked at all the different options, I looked at value for money, and I chose the picture, and this one had the best picture, and I read an article on televisions, and this was the best one. Now, sometimes we choose like that, okay? But in some categories, some people, some of the time, do choose like that. That's what's called being a maximizer. Most of the time, our actual consideration is not what is the best thing I can get for X pounds. It's actually how can I be sure I can avoid disaster or rubbish. So fear plays a greater part in human action than hope. So is the branded television the best television you can buy for the money? Very possibly not. But if you look at what people care about deep down, what they're most involved with is actually avoiding buying a bad television. It's not buying the perfect television. Now, I can prove this very beautifully. If I asked you all to think of the best meal you've ever had in your life, okay, the best restaurant meal you've ever had in your life, and then I asked you to think where it was, and then I asked you the question, how many times have you eaten at that restaurant? Most people actually say twice or once. And you ask about the best restaurant meal you've ever had in your life, and people think of an expensive restaurant they once went to in Italy where the meal cost $6, and you said, well, how many times have you been there? Once. You say, well, if it was so good, why didn't you go back? Because let's face it, you've been to McDonald's 50 times. Now, if you want to understand why McDonald's is so spectacularly successful, you need to understand satisficing, not maximizing. Which is, there probably are very few towns in the world where McDonald's is the best restaurant in town. Bakersfield, California, quite likely, but I mean, there are places, El Paso, Texas, although there's an Arby's there, in fact. But the fact of the matter is, most of the time we eat out, we're not maximizing, we're going, actually, I haven't got time or the mental energy to find out what the best restaurant in town is. All I want is a pretty good meal that won't be rubbish, okay? Now, McDonald's is not the best restaurant in the world, but it's the most successful restaurant in the world, precisely because it's brilliant at being not shit. Okay? So what I mean is, you will never get ripped off. You won't be disappointed by the food because it's extremely consistent. The lavatories will be clean. The prices will be reasonable. It will be safe. And incidentally, you won't get a stomach bug. We can all agree on this. I've been to Michelin-starred restaurants, and probably 10 times more often you get ill from eating a meal at a Michelin-starred restaurant than you do from eating at McDonald's. Fair? I mean, you've never had a stomach upset from McDonald's. Anybody? I'm just saying, now, if you think about the number of meals they serve, that's pretty astounding when you think about it. So, looked at from a policy of loss aversion, most of the time we're looking for something that's not crap. We're not looking to maximize. Now, there are exceptions. If you're a really keen motorcyclist, when you buy a motorbike, you're probably maximizing. You read a load of stuff about it, you talk to your friends. But to a huge extent, what we're looking for is a safety net, something that's going to be at least pretty good. Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's, put this beautifully. He said, people aren't looking for the best burger in the world. They want a burger that's just like the one they had last time. They're actually consistently pretty good. It's why actually in many cases I think brands like Google become so dominant. Because when you're free and pretty damn good, even if people come along who are better, actually most people aren't interested. They rather have the search engine that's like the one they used last time than have a slightly better search engine. And most of the time we're satisficing. Most of the time the heuristic is, basically, first default, probably do what I did last time. Very, very strong default. You know, do the same as last time. If that isn't possible for some reason, your default is then do what's most famous or what most people seem to be doing. So if I can't buy my usual brand, what's the brand here that actually seems to have most on the shelves, for example, or that I've heard of most often? And then the third default might be just do what's easy, do what's easiest. But brand preference doesn't necessarily come particularly high there. And there's increasing argument that says that actually things work backwards. I've talked about satisficing, that people actually work out what to buy from the bottom, not from the top. They work it out through a process of elimination. And they probably don't have preference in terms of coffee shops. They have a repertoire of 4 coffee shops which are all acceptable. That's the difference between sales and salability. Okay? The other thing, and this is really, really important, is there's a lot of evidence. You will occasionally get people bullying you as affiliate marketers, saying, but it's not doing a proper brand job, it's not really shifting perception, it's just selling. Okay? But increasingly, behavioral scientists are starting to believe that actually people's behavioral change precedes attitudinal change, not the other way around. Now, I'm going to just pause for a second so that can sink in. In other words, what Bob Dylan says in Brownsville Girl is, people don't do what they say they believe, they do what's convenient and then they repent. Now, this seems very, very strange to you all, because you've all had this model of human behavior which suggests that in order to get someone to change their behavior, you must first change their mind. Increasingly, it appears that this is wrong. The trick is to get people to change their behavior. Even better to get them to change their behavior visibly, because then other people automatically start copying them. If you think about it, it matters that the Prius looks different to other cars. Do you see what I mean? Because by driving a Prius, it is visible that other people are driving hybrid cars. But changing behavior may precede a change in attitude. So in other words, don't try and persuade people to love trees. Make it easier for them to recycle their rubbish. As a result of making it easier, they will start recycling their rubbish, and as a byproduct of the act of recycling their rubbish, they will become favorably disposed to recycling. Do you see what I'm saying here? Now, I know this goes completely contrary to everything you've always assumed. And there are cases where that may not apply. But broadly speaking, people behave subconsciously, and the rational mind actually post-rationalizes to make sense of behavior which is very often emotionally driven or subconsciously driven. Now, why that's so important is because billions of pounds are wasted by environmentalists trying to persuade everybody to share their own motivation, because they think in order for people to love the planet and be kind to the planet, they must have the same motivation as me and they must love trees. You don't need to do that. Just make electric cars really cool. Make it easy to recycle rubbish. Make the behavior you want to see easier to adopt. People will do it, and the attitude follows. There's a very depressing sentence which Professor Paul Dolan and I coined. He's a professor at the London School of Economics and an expert on well-being and behavioral science, which is when you hear a man say, "My wife doesn't understand me," It doesn't mean he's going to have an affair. It means he's already had one. Okay, so what actually happens if you look at real human behavior is not that people go, I'm noticing increasing comprehension issues with my wife at home, so I think I might start outsourcing some sexual services. And that's obviously what they'd say if they're consultants, of course. You know, I might try offshoring to exotic foreign locations. Okay? What actually happens, bluntly, I'm not just excusing men here, and Paul Doe and I have to say this doesn't apply to us, it's just observation, okay, is that people get pissed at a party, and without really intending to, they end up having an affair or sleeping with somebody else. And in a desperate effort to make sense of their incongruous behavior, they blame it on their wife. But until that happened, they had no particular issues with the person they're married to at all. It was contrived as an effort to make conscious sense of actually what was to some extent unconscious or non-intentional behavior. So the conscious brain is less like the Oval Office of human decision-making, actually making the executive decisions. It's much closer to the press office. So actually, rather than actually making the decisions and enacting them, the actual conscious brain is really there issuing press releases to explain decisions that were taken somewhere down in the basement. But understanding that it may work the other way around is really, really, really important, particularly if you're in a behavioral business like yours. There are huge cases where I'd say people would obsess about how do you build this so-and-so online e-tail brand. I said, it's very easy. Get people to shop from it 2 or 3 times. And as a product of using it 3 or 4 times, assuming their experience isn't awful, they'll like it. And actually, a very good book, Byron Sharp, How Brands Grow, shows this effect. That actually, the degree of affection towards a brand is always proportional to its dominance in the marketplace. So the brands that more people buy and more often always have more favorable brand attributes than brands that fewer people buy less often. Now, what that's counter to, it says that behavior drives attitude. Now, if you think about it, loads of people believe in niche brands. They believe in these niche brands that not many people buy, but the people who buy them really, really love them. But you can look at tons and tons of research, and those don't really exist, which I think is fairly good proof that actually it is the behavior, the purchase behavior, that drives the attitude more than the other way around. However, don't forget that point about saleability. If you don't have the initial brand attributes that mean people are happy to give you a try, that mean you sit on people's repertoire, you won't get there in the first place. Now, this is what I call the missing 50% of marketing. You know, it's the electromagnetism. Those bits you've all seen because of the business you work in. Actually, market research would never tell us this. Logic doesn't tell us this. But all these people suddenly seem to be buying this thing. Ludwig von Mises, great hero of mine, Austrian school economist, he made the point that first thing you've got to understand is that all value is subjective. He makes the point that it's completely wrong to say there's real value, which happens when you make a product, and then there's like bogus value when you market it and create things around it. He says that to say that actually, you know, he says if you run a restaurant, it is ridiculous to make a distinction between the value you create by cooking the food and the value you create by sweeping the floor. The context in which, the mental context and frame in which the good is consumed is as much a part of creating the value as the creation of the good itself. Got that? If you think about it, if you imagined a restaurant which served absolutely fantastic food, but the floor was littered with like poo and turds and human detritus, okay? It would be ridiculous to say that the only valid thing you can do is make the food even better. Nobody would enjoy that food because the context in which it was consumed was so disgusting. And that's exactly what advertising does. It creates a context within which that good can be enjoyed and appreciated subjectively. And the way we look at things, value is subjective. Unless you're a Marxist, you have to accept this. Ludwig von Mises made the point, there used to be these people called the French physiocrats who believed that only true value came from what you extracted from the land. So if you're a shepherd or a quarryman, you created value, but if you then took the shepherd's wool and made it into a hat, you were exploiting the shepherd. Okay? Now, it's complete nonsense, and Ludwig von Mises, all economists acknowledge that this is complete rubbish. He said, but then most economists make exactly that mistake with regard to advertising and marketing. They think that making the product is good value creation, and advertising and marketing is fake value creation. Ludwig von Mises says it's completely wrong to draw a distinction between those two. So value is subjective. Actually, economists know it, but they really hate it. And actually, our clients don't really like it. Because most clients, most senior clients, have an engineering background, particularly in Germany, I imagine. And so they tend to think, if you think what I'm saying, that the thing you produce is the value thing, and that the human context or subjectivity is a fluffy thing that shouldn't really have any effect on your appreciation of my magnificent engineering. But it doesn't work like that, okay? You can't separate the two as far as our perception goes. This is a beautiful case of creating value if you can whack the sound up. Kick the sound up? Is it not going up? Perfect.
Shreddies are supposed to be square.
Have any of these diamond shapes gone out?
New Diamond Shreddies cereal. Same 100% whole grain wheat in a delicious diamond shape.
Sales went up. This was the poster campaign. This is what I'm saying, but if you just change the way someone looks at something, you change their valuation of the thing, okay? Now, Canadians are quite conservative, and some people didn't like, it was a bit of a new Coke moment, they didn't like the fact that their old traditional square shreddies had been taken off the market without anybody consulting them. And they wanted to bring back square shreddies, and they didn't like any of this diamond shreddies nonsense. So in a very Canadian way, they arrived at a compromise. 50% of each, I counted them. But you can actually do market research that shows people who actually claim that the shreddies taste different when you describe them as diamond shreddies. They zing a bit more. And there's a great definition of poetry, make new things familiar and familiar things new, which is a good definition of advertising. Take things that are familiar and get people to look at them in a new way, or take things that are new and help people familiarize themselves. Ludwig von Mises also created or used a doctrine called praxeology, which is a science of human action and decision-making. And this is what I call the missing 50% of marketing. We don't really understand, or the conventional marketing model, by fetishizing brand preference as if it's the only force at work, is blind to most of the other stuff going on. The other thing is decisions are contextual. And this is what's so important for you affiliate guys, okay? Which is something I don't want in situation A is something I want desperately in situation B. And this even applies to value. If you think about it, for a cup of tea, obviously if you're Germans you don't have tea at all, but for a cup of tea at home, because the really good technology the British have mastered, which is actually boiling water at 100 degrees. But unfortunately on the continent they don't have the technology or something. So anyway, just thought I'd make that little lesson. But actually, people will pay about 2 or 3 pence for a cup of tea at home. When they go to Starbucks, even if they're taking it away, they're not even sitting around for an hour, they'll pay about £2. Now, it's clear that it's not twice as enjoyable having a cup of tea there than it is, or 100 times as enjoyable as it is having a cup of tea at home. But nonetheless, depending on the context, we don't have an internal unit of pleasure that says, for this much pleasure, I'm prepared to pay €1. For twice as much pleasure, I'll pay €2. We don't have one. So our measure of value and what things are worth is totally dependent on the context and the circumstances. In fact, all human perception, unbelievably, is relativistic. It is all contextual. Now, look at square A and square B. A is one of the dark squares, and you probably all see it as being much darker than square B, which is one of the light squares. Now, I mean, A is much darker than B, isn't it? I mean, it's not just a question of you see it as that. It is a darker square until I actually change the thing. And if you wait 10 seconds, you'll see that the shade of grey is exactly the same. A is exactly as dark as B. No darker, no less dark. All human perception, temperature, volume, tiny exception is the 2% of people who have perfect pitch. That's a real oddity in human perceptual terms, because people actually have an absolute measure of pitch if you have perfect pitch. But everything else, volume, temperature, pain, pleasure, size, all our perceptions operate on a relativistic scale. It's not absolute, it's relative. So as you can see, they're the same grey, but the second I actually replace the context, it's now impossible, I think, for you to see those two squares as the same colour again. Is that fair? I mean, they now look different. If I show you this example, the rectangle in the middle, ignore the two ends, looks pretty much like and indeed it is a constant grey rectangle, the same grey from left to right. Yet if I change the context, it's now impossible for you to see that as what it is, which is a constant grey rectangle. So our perception, even applying to size, the blob on the right looks bigger, the orange blob, they're actually exactly the same. So all our perception is subjective and contextual and relative. So something you try and sell in place A, you may be able to sell at 20% more than that exact same thing in place B. There is no absolute value to which you have to adhere. Now, this is hugely important, if you ask me, for marketing. Now, looked at interestingly, I suddenly looked at behavioral economics and said, there are a whole load of problems we can solve here, which we've never had the tools to solve before. And one of my first suggestions was, if you want people to complete a course of antibiotics to prevent resistant strains of bacteria developing, most people give up early. They go, I feel better now, these antibiotics make me feel a bit shit, I can't drink alcohol, I'll give up after about 15, okay? And it's a big problem because resistant bacteria develop. Don't give people 24 white pills, give them 20 white pills and 4 blue pills, and say, take the white ones, and when you finish the white ones, take the blue ones. The likelihood that people will complete the course is vastly higher. It's because of something called chunking, which is it's easier to get someone to do something in 2 stages than it is in one. It's exactly the same reason you have a loading bar in software, that people will hang around and persist with waiting if they can see some mark of progress. Whereas if it's just, if you don't know what's happening, you're much less likely to actually stick around. This is something I invented in conjunction with BBDO in Australia. It's impulse saving. My view is that the financial industry is obsessed with the idea that everybody decides to save in a completely rational way. Oh, I know, I want to speak to an independent financial advisor, and then I want to fill in 5 forms, and, bollocks. Actually, our savings decisions are probably just as impulsive as our decisions to borrow or to spend. And my view is, since there are 1,000 shops everywhere which give you the opportunity to impulse buy, shouldn't we create a mechanism for people to impulse save? This is on an iPhone. You choose the amount from $5 to 100 Kiwi dollars, New Zealand dollars. Every time you press that button, it goes ka-ching, and it moves that amount of money into your savings account. So just as you can shop pissed, you can save pissed. Now, if you think about this, in behavioral terms, people are hugely influenced by hassle, and they love immediacy. They absolutely love immediate gratification. How many women's shoe shops would there be if women's shoe shops applied the same discipline that banks do? Well, I'm afraid you'll have to wait 48 hours for the delivery of your shoes, and you'll have to fill in 5 forms before you... The magic would have gone, wouldn't it, frankly, most of the time? You'd actually decide you didn't want the shoes. The credit card is a hugely successful invention simply because it makes possible that kind of impulse purchase. I'll skip this one just for reasons of time. Here are other examples of context. If you offer €3,000 on the trade-in price at a car dealership, it is vastly more successful in offering $3,000 off the purchase price of a new car. Why is that? It's a framing effect. $3,000 on top of the $8,000 you get for your car seems a much bigger discount than knocking $3,000 off the purchase price of a car, which is €20,000 or dollars, say. Okay? So they tested this in Germany, and as a result, a lot of economists said, but it's exactly the same. Either way, you save €3,000. Who would care? See? And the person said, it's the same if you're an economist or an accountant. It's not the same if you're a human being. And they tested it, and this business of offering €3,000 on the trade-in sold 20,000 more cars in Germany than the equivalent of knocking €3,000 off a purchase price. That's the extent to which human perception of things and human perception of discounts is hugely contextual. And I'll show you a few more examples. This is another relative framing effect. People have always failed to sell video conferencing because of what they've compared it to. They've made it the poor man's version of British Airways. It's the poor man's Lufthansa. Well, if you can't quite be bothered to go and see your client in person, here's a cheap alternative. It's video conferencing. What you should do is make it the rich man's phone call. If I was Cisco, I'd say, we will only install telepresence equipment in your chief executive's office. We will not install it in a basement room. So, because what happened to this technology, it became like the pager to the mobile phone. That's what your boss gave you when you weren't trusted with a mobile phone. Margarine to the butter of British Airways. It was an inferior substitute to the real thing. So what we compare things to has a huge effect on how we value them. And it's pretty arbitrary. Watch this with estate agents. They will often, if they want to sell you a particular house, they will take you to a slightly worse but similar house immediately beforehand that's not quite as good as the house they want to sell you and claim that it's priced a bit higher. They may have no intention of selling that first house. They are merely creating a comparison which makes it easier for you to buy the house they want to sell you. So be very, very wary of estate agents who occasionally create a completely dummy house at a price they have no intention of ever getting in order to make you feel better about saying, well, this one's 2,000 euros less and it's got a greenhouse, okay? So watch that comparative effect. But equally, it's really, really important in terms of how we sell things. The context in which things are framed, and you people, in many cases, are in the business of context creation. How can I create a context which will be perfect to sell X? You're also in the beautiful business of being able to measure the effect that context has on behavior and action. This is a brilliant case of framing. How many of you have an espresso machine? Brilliant. They're absolutely fantastic. I love mine like a child. But the fact remains, if you had to pay for this stuff in a jar like Nescafe, you couldn't bring yourself to pay for it. Because it'd be like buying a really large jar of Nescafe and paying 200 euros for it. Okay? You couldn't do it. But because this coffee comes in little pods, our frame of reference isn't Nescafe, it's Starbucks. And we go, well, actually, I pay £1 for a shot of coffee at Starbucks, so 26 pence, it's a bit of a bargain. Do you see what I mean? That the whole concept of what's cheap or what's expensive is completely determined by a fairly arbitrary comparison. Amazon Prime is a brilliant example of the psychology. I realize that economists and accountants don't understand psychology. When a load of people said, if Amazon Prime's so effective, why don't Amazon just give free next-day shipping to everybody? You value this product precisely because you have to pay for it and it feels exclusive. It's actually a form of gamification, I think, which is, I've paid them £30, but I'm going to get the better of those bastards because I'm going to start ordering light bulbs from Amazon. You know, in order to make my money back on free delivery. Oh, we've run out of lavatory paper. Amazon, okay? Now, they, of course, win. But the psychology of the thing is totally different when you pay for it versus if you don't. You know, and actually, the psychology of offers, we are hugely, one of the very, very powerful heuristics is scarcity value. We just value things that seem to be exclusive and scarce. And so, broadly speaking, you know, if you drop the price of something to everybody, we tend to just value that thing a bit less. You know, if BMW dropped all their prices by 15%, you'd be a bit more likely to buy a BMW. But if you had a mate who worked for a BMW dealership who said, because I'm your mate, I can get you 15% off, you'd be a lot more likely to buy one. So our perception of the exclusivity and the limited nature of the offer affects our valuation of the offer. That's really, really important. Because some offers actually have a negative effect on people's value perception of the brand and the product. But if you phrase offers cleverly, you don't have that problem at all. That usual accusation that offers are actually, you know, selling the brand short is sometimes true, but it isn't always true. This is a really interesting case where I went to Spotify and said, I think you're making a mistake giving people infinite music because people don't know what infinite music's worth. They don't have a comparison. It's like me going to you and saying, would you like to buy my unicorn? Well, yeah, but how much do I pay for a unicorn? No one's ever bought one before, okay? Now, I said, actually, if you actually artificially said 200 tracks a month, £10, people go, well, 200 tracks a month, that's about 15 CDs. 15 CDs, I'd normally pay 150 euros or thereabouts. So 10 euros on £10 a month, that's a bit of a bargain. I can do the maths, I can make the trade-off, that works. If you say infinite music, as Nokia did, as Spotify did, arguably people just don't know what that's worth. They can't do the calculations. They also feel that because I'll only be downloading about 100 tracks a month, I'll be actually subsidizing all these wankers who are downloading 10,000. So actually, now this is what market research won't tell you and what logic won't tell you, but making your product worse may actually increase its sales. Do you see what I'm saying? That artificially limiting things, if you say on an offer, actually maximum 4 per household, more people respond to the offer and they tend to buy 4 or 3 of the product. Really, really small things in psychology have huge effects. Read this on Google. It's a case study where changing the wording on one button on the purchase page of one website increased annual sales by $300 million. There is a psychological thing which I don't fully understand, which is people are perfectly happy to buy from you, give you your credit card, give you their credit card, and then register, leave the email address and all that stuff. If you ask them to do it the other way around, they hate it. Okay? Now, what they're doing is the same in both cases. The order shouldn't matter all that much. What they did here is instead of saying register, they said continue. And it said, you can leave your details with us later, but let's get on. You don't need to register in order to buy with us. And by actually changing the order of that thing, annual sales on one e-tailer's website, $300 million up, directly attributable to one trivial psychological insight. This is how people shop comparatively. 4 beers, 30p Tesco Lager, £1 Carling, £2 Budweiser, £4 Kronenberg. So that's in a bottle. Normally, with just these two, 33% by the Carling, 67% by the Bud. Add this 30p lager. In this case, nobody buys it, but it drags the whole category down market. So now 47% of people are buying the Carling, 53% are buying the Bud. One of the strongest heuristics when presented with 3 things is buy the one in the middle, okay? Because the expensive one's a rip-off, the cheap one's shit, and the one in the middle's about right, okay? Now, take away the 30p Tesco lager, pop in the £4 super premium French lager, 10% of people buy that, 90% of people buy this one, and nobody buys that one. Now, bear in mind, logic doesn't tell you this, market research doesn't tell you this. No one actually says, what lager do you buy? They say, oh, well, my favorite brand is the one I buy most often. What actually happens in reality is people buy according to what else is on the shelf. That actually the context and what Richard Thaler calls the choice architecture massively affects the choice. There's a brilliant phrase, if you're in interface design, you're in social engineering whether you like it or not. Because where you place the button, how you design the button, the word you put on the button affects the way people behave. And there's no avoiding that. You may not like the thought that you're a social engineer. I'm afraid you are. Logic won't tell you, research won't tell you. Red Bull, to some extent, could charge £1.50 precisely because they made the can smaller. Now, nobody would say, you see, that made it feel like a different category of drink from Coca-Cola or Fanta or Tango or anything else. So people suddenly thought, well, that's a different kind of drink. It's in a funny-shaped can. Therefore, I'll pay £1.50 for it. Now, logic and market research, no one's going to say, I'm not paying £1.50 for that drink, mate. But if you gave me less of it, then I would. Okay? But that's effectively the way that human logic works. If you want to sell these cars offline, don't sell them at car shows. Sell them at plane and yacht shows. It's a ludicrously expensive car if you've just been wandering around a car show, but if you've been looking at Learjets and 200-foot yachts all day, you've decided in a burst of responsibility not to buy a mega yacht or a Learjet just that week. And on the way out, you see those, you go, I'll have a couple of those instead. Okay? There are perception of how, by the way, the effect apparently lasts about 40 minutes. This anchoring, the price anchoring effect seems to last about 40 minutes. Offline, apparently, one of the most successful efforts to sell flat-screen TVs from banners was on very high-end holiday sites. And the guy who actually was the founder of 24/7, who was telling me about this, didn't know why. And they'd come up with loads of theories like that looking at scenery made you want a big telly. And I said, no, there's one really simple explanation if you're a behavioral economist, which is that if you spent 40 minutes looking at $3,000 holidays online, a $900 television actually seems okay. You know, whereas if you've been shopping for milk or, you know, or small items, the comparison's completely different. Time really, really matters. Do you have a target? Does a brand have a target audience at all, or does it have a target moment? And that's a really important question. There are huge elements of human behavior where actually who you're talking to is almost irrelevant. The argument you use is almost irrelevant. All that matters is time. Now, to give you an example of how little persuasion, in many ways, and persuasion is the opposite of seduction. It's not very effective, okay? And yet advertising is obsessed with the persuasive power of ads because it thinks everything operates at the rational persuasive level. But actually, if you think about persuasion, it's a crap form of seduction. That's all it is. If you ever hear a man or a woman say, I persuaded her to sleep with me, or I persuaded him to sleep with me, okay? That's not indicative of a great relationship, to be honest, is it? It's probably something that's going to happen once, okay? So persuasion and factual information and argument is a very, very bad way of changing behavior. What you need is moments, seduction, context, framing, those kind of things are what changes behavior. To give you an example of how little effect information has on behavior, as a French doctor, you're no less likely to smoke than any other Frenchman. So you may have seen the consequences of smoking, you know all the statistics, but you are no less likely to smoke than any other Frenchman. I did explain this partly by saying that as a smoking French doctor, you are, of course, the sexiest man in the world, because you can just go, I'm a doctor. and people immediately come running. But nonetheless, facts aren't all that great in getting people to change their behavior. So interestingly, my argument is, actually, if you want people to give up smoking, you will have markedly more success if you can reach people when they've got a bad cold or flu. And quit attempts that start when someone has flu or a bad cold are about 30 to 40% more likely to succeed than quit attempts undertaken at any other time. So that ability to look for context that's really complementary to what you want to sell. What's the target moment? What's the target mood? What's the target mindset? Rather than what's the target market? That's the really vital thing. Preference, actually, is something we beat out of people with market research. But most people don't have that strong a preference. I was looking at some research, there are people who say, I won't travel by train. I don't use the train. About 40 to 50% of Britons say this. But the reason they say that is because they haven't traveled by train. It's not really attitude. It's a product of the fact that no one's caught them at the right moment and said, you should do that trip by train, So these are two heroes of behavioral economics. Ludwig von Mises on the left, Daniel Kahneman on the right. There's a final thing I'd like to leave with is the idea of complementarity, which is another economic concept closely related to context, which is the value of things depends on what you sell them alongside, which is another really, really useful concept to affiliate marketing. The Michelin Guide is the perfect example of complementarity. Michelin had about 90% of the French tire market in 1900. What they needed was not, market share. They needed people to drive further. So they said, if we produce a guide to restaurants and interesting sites, that is information which is complementary to the consumption of tire rubber. In other words, the more of this information people consume, the more tire rubber they'll consume. Now, extreme examples of complementarity, free peanuts at a bar is an example where you give the peanuts away free and people enjoy the drink more and drink more. That's why bars give you free peanuts. The strangest one of all, I think, in complementarity is popcorn, which is something which is completely worthless unless you're at the cinema, in which case you pay about £8 for it. If you went outside on the street and there's a bloke selling popcorn, going, buy your popcorn here, you piss off, stupid wanker. But for some reason, you go to the cinema, and it's like the most wonderful food that God's ever created, okay? Complementarity is a really interesting, useful thing, which realizes that value is not absolute. It depends, again, on what's around it. Another beautiful example, the Michelin Guides, I think, are a beautiful example of complementarity. They're also, I think their brands, Pernod, is absolutely delicious if you're in France, but tastes absolute rubbish anywhere else. Anybody else have the same effect? You drink pastis in France, you go, this is delicious and sophisticated. I will buy a litre bottle and take it back to London. You pour yourself, it's piss, what on earth did I buy this? So there's a beautiful example of complementarity, which was a pizza delivery firm which was planning to install DVD burners next to the pizza ovens. So you could order a film to be burnt on demand and to be delivered along with your pizza. That's a really, really useful concept. And to look at in terms of how can we create content or information that is complementary to the consumption of the primary good is just a really, really useful way to think. So there we go. Context or complementarity is what you're selling. The one thing I'd like to ask you as a sort of favor afterwards is just to think about is, all of you, I imagine, come up with occasional findings that are just as weird as hell. Like you're selling a particular product and that, weirdly, on a particular shirt-selling site, you sell 20 times more of them than anything else. What's a pity is this information, if it were pooled, would be actually really, really valuable to behavioral scientists and to marketers. The problem is, why would you give it away to your competitors? One thing I would urge is to go to an academic institution like a university or the Max Planck Institute or what are those things you have in Germany, the institutes or industrial research institutes, and create an entity that can actually pool these really interesting findings and actually derive behavioral conclusions from them in a way that benefits the whole industry. I think there's scope here for something in affiliate marketing, which is a central academic entity, which actually analyzes exceptional results from what you're doing and attempts to find explanations. The final thing I'll end with is just a beautiful example of how new advertising can actually do a wonderful job of using context. And I'll show you this very short film, after which point I promise I've finished. But I think it's just a lovely example of how digital things can be... Ooh. Rory Sutherland is probably in here. Can be how digital is a glorious, glorious way of creating context and making messages contextually relevant and meaningful and valuable. And here it goes. Thanks very much.
Business, a modern piece of glasswork down on the corner that you walk each day in passing. The elderly says clerk won't ask with suspicion. The whole of motor corporation's giving its permission. A little stairway, a little piece of carpet, a pair of mirrors that are facing one another. Out in both directions, 1,000 little Julias. They come together in the middle of Manhattan. You waited since lunch. It all comes at once. Famous Williams. Indeed.